I'm Andrew Foster. Did you want me to sort of say a few words?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm the editor of the Journal of Development Economics, so leading field journal that is really responsible for all of you. I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to sort of highlight about the JD. We've sort of created some innovations. One is we have this registered reports program, which is this two-stage review where we look at your sort of what sort of a pre-analysis plan, but looks more like a sort of paper without the results. And we can agree in principle to publish the paper, and then you go out and do your work, and it comes back. We get about one of those a month. We have about 25 initial acceptances, so that's kind of working out well. But it hasn't. We don't have as many of them as we expected. There's no commitment to publish with us, and so even if you get a first stage acceptance from us, you're welcome to send it to a top journal. We've had, I think, 1 or 2 cases like that. So we also have a short paper format that's worked extremely well. We get sort of I would say 5 or 6 a month in there, and they've been really very good. We've been very happy with the series. Tom Vogel has been the editor of that. He sort of handles that full time. I think the sort of acceptance rates are higher than our normal acceptance rates, about 25% actually. I think that reflects the quality of the papers, not that we have easier standards there, but we're getting good. So I can encourage you to think about that. And let me just say, this is a field journal, but we've had a big impact in our impact factor. It's about 5 now, which is the hood of some of the general interest journals, second-tier general interest journals anyway. Very competitive, 5 or 6%, and it really is seen as a sort of leading journal of the field, and often people look for publications in a top field journal as part of a tenure case. So.
Great, thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Tavneet Suri. I'm one of the editors for the Review of Economics and Statistics. I guess we don't have as much to say about our journal that's specific other than it's restat. We did add short papers thanks to, I think, Rema, who's sitting on my left, about 2 years ago, 3? Oh my God, 5. Yeah, so whenever I say 2 years, add 3 for COVID. So it becomes 5. So about 5 years ago, but we do have short papers. I actually don't get that many short paper submissions, but we do have a version of that.
All right, I'm Melissa Dell. I don't know if I introduced myself before. I'm at the Journal of Political Economy. And I think one of the main things that I'd like to emphasize to people that I didn't even fully appreciate that before I was there and editing a ton of papers is just how tough it is to get in. I mean, we're talking under 5%. There's so many great papers that there's just not space for. So certainly, don't feel bad. It's that's just the way that publishing is. I mean, we are a general interest journal, and that's something that we definitely have to take into account. There's some papers that are amazing papers, but they're mostly of interest to people in the field, and that does kind of come into the decision process. I guess the other thing I'd like to say is that I know in the past JPE response times have sometimes been long, and I think that is a thing of the past. It will not be more than 5 months. It will not. And if it's that long, it's usually, something has happened. Maybe a referee had an emergency in their lives, or, we had to go out for multiple rounds, but the expectation is less than 5 months, and it won't be more than 5 months because, I completely understand that nobody wants their paper to be stuck somewhere for a long period.
Thanks. I'm Ben Olken. I'm the editor of AEJ Applied. I have a couple of things I wanted to mention about AEJ Applied. So the first of all, let me also just say, like Melissa said, it's normal to get your papers rejected. It's not pleasant. It happens to all of us. But you do the math, and if most of these journals have a 5, 6, 7% acceptance rate, that means that the vast majority of papers are getting rejected. And it's unfortunate, but it happens to all of us. And certainly for myself, I'll say when I get my papers rejected, I know it's really frustrating. I try to put them aside for a week and then, calm down and then, open them up and move on. So I just want to say that's normal and just part of the process and happens to everybody, including everyone on this stage. The second thing I wanted to say a couple of things specifically to AEJ Applied. One thing you'll notice as you go to apply to different journals, some journals ask you if you have an editor preference or not. Some journals do not. So you should be aware of that when you submit to journals. At our journal, there's no need to pre-select an editor. In fact, we don't encourage that, and we just assign papers to which editor we think is kind of most appropriate. So no need to think about that at our journal, but just wanted to note that some heterogeneity across journals. The main thing I wanted to talk about that's different between AEJ Applied and other journals is we have, because we're part of the American Economic Association, we have an explicit kind of pass down option from the AER. So if, for example, you get your paper rejected from the AER, which happens pretty often, if the AER editor thinks that your paper might be very promising for AEJ Applied, they may signal that in the editor letter, and then you may have a choice. So your choice, if you decide to submit to AEJ Applied, you have an option of passing down the editor reports, the referee reports, and the confidential cover letters that are sent to the AER editors to the AEJ Applied editorial team. You also have an option in that case of either writing the paper just as is with kind of a 5-page memo explaining how you would change the paper in response to the editor, the comments, but you don't actually have to do it all. And the idea that the reason we did that is we don't want people to sort of waste a huge amount of time, revising their paper for some idiosyncratic referee comments, if in fact it's not going to fly. So you can do that, submit your paper totally as is, and we'll take a look at sort of those materials. Or you have an option of, if you want to do a more extensive revision, you can do that too, and you have a cover letter explaining that. Those cases we are more likely to send it out to review again. I wouldn't encourage, you shouldn't necessarily do this all the time. I think that typically, if you're getting guidance from the AER editors, that's because it's because they've seen that sort of there's something in the referee reports or cover letters that suggests it's kind of a good fit for AEJ Applied. If you're not getting that guidance, it may not be the best option for you. So I just wanted to let you just think about that, and because you don't necessarily see kind of all the materials, including the confidential cover letters. So that's, I think, the only AEJ Applied specific information. I think that I'll pass it on to Rema.
So hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Rema Hanna. I'm an editor at the AER. I've been an editor for 9 years. I was at Journal of Human Resources for 3 years, Restat for 3 years, and now AER for 2.5. And so I'm happy to answer questions across the board. I'm going to note, well, there's 2 things I wanted to say. The first is just to follow up on what Ben said. With the drop down feature, I think one thing I try to do is I often get sort of confidential information from referees about where they think the journal should place, and then I read it on my own as well. And so I try to give some guidance about the dropdown. And so hopefully that helps you as you're trying to think about where to send the paper next. But the main thing I wanted to say is, I remember when I was a graduate student, you get all this mentoring and advising on how to write your paper, but you actually get very little information about how to publish. And so I remember getting my first, I got rejected, and then I got an R&R, and I thought the R&R was a rejection because of the way it was written, of maybe if you want to submit, this paper is terrible, you can do all these things to it, and maybe if you want to resubmit, and I didn't realize it was an R&R, and the publishing process is just, I think, is a big mystery. And so I really want to thank Melissa for organizing this today. Why we're all here is to try to answer the questions you have and demystify it a bit. And hopefully, it is a tough process. Hopefully you learn a lot through the process as well. Hopefully you're getting good feedback and stuff, but anything we can do today to help make the process more transparent and easier to understand, you should feel free to be open asking us questions. Thanks.
All right. So now we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Who wants to be first? This will be a very, very short session if there's no questions. Yes.
Yeah, so do the journals organize any mentoring programs for young scholars? Before that, you organize some mentoring by which they can be oriented to publish such papers, something of that kind?
I don't think we do. I mean, honestly, I don't think we have the capacity to do so. I do think, and actually, yeah, I don't think we don't have the capacity to do so. I do think, as you're in, at least for me, I feel like I often get emails from former students saying, I'm thinking about where to submit, where should I submit to? I often get emails of, I got rejected or I got an R&R. Can you give me some advice? And I think most people are pretty happy, talking to former grad students or my juniors in my department, so you shouldn't feel shy about asking advice from the people around you. But it would be nice if they could, but I think we're just so capacity constrained.
The AEA does do a mentoring session. So the AEA has one that's separate from the journals. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but I would go to the AEA website and check. And there might be a couple of other kind of broader mentoring places. So it might be worth looking at those. And when I've done those, a lot of it is about these sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think the JD actually does sort of have a mentoring program. This goes back a few years. I haven't mentioned it, but for any rejection from the paper, we add a little thing in it that says, if you're interested in receiving sort of mentoring this paper, you're welcome to apply through this angle. Now, this was supported by Dean Carlin at Northwestern. He's left, but it's still there. We found very low uptake, and so we haven't sort of done that much of it. And it's hard to really. We had an idea of kind of doing it as an experiment just to see if we could have an impact, but the numbers haven't been there. So if there were resurgence in interest, we would go about and try to do that. It basically pairs, particularly people from the low-income world, which we as the Journal of Development Economics feel a particular responsibility to help support, with sort of leading young scholars from the United States, typically, or Europe, and gets them to read the papers carefully and make some suggestions and so forth. It's kind of low touch, but it is there. You can respond. It's still live. And as I say, if there were, a lot of people responding, we would find other ways to do it. And for those of you who are more senior, if you're interested, you can let me know in playing that role.
Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, it's me. Okay. What's your thoughts on some advice that so some supervisor advice, if you finish your paper, once it's readable, just send it to the journal and then you get feedback. But some other advice is, oh no, you need to go to a lot of conference, get more feedback, and make sure it's like in the best shape possible. What do you guys think about that? Is that a good strategy to try to wait for like 5 months and then get a good feedback, or is
I think we're all going to have different views on that one.
I would say the second one.
Oh, I would say the second one too. All right.
One.
Yeah.
So you should not think of you should really not think of my own view. You should not be thinking of the publication process as a process for getting feedback and iterating for a couple of reasons. First of all, it may not happen. Just to be totally transparent, we summarily reject, reject about half of our, at least at AEJ Applied, between half and 60% of our papers without getting referee comments. So you're not going to get a lot, and that happens, you're not going to get a lot of feedback, and you're better off sort of polishing your paper to the point where it's more likely to get sent to referees. And I should say, by the way, we do that sort of just to be efficient. Part of the way that we can sort of get back to everyone quickly is by triaging, and sort of, we tried at AEJ Applied to get back to every paper within 3 months. Mechanically, the only way we can do that is by first having a look, and we have a good sense of which papers are likely to, make it all the way through. And if we think it's unlikely to happen, we're just going to make that decision ex ante. So that's the first reason. The second reason is there's, referees are going to see your paper, once, and they're going to look at it, and you want them to sort of make the best impression. Certainly for my own papers, for example, I try to get them really, really polished before I send them to a journal.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I just didn't know if we would all agree. I think getting more feedback before you send it to a journal is better. You want to raise the probability you actually get referees to look. And sometimes you'll get repeat referees across journals. And, something I've seen a lot is it's hard to get people to change their minds. We're human beings. If they've seen it once, they're going to want to see a big change. And it's just, if you have already feedback from a whole bunch of different people, you're going to kind of avoid some of those smaller pitfalls in the process. So I would say the second two.
I also agree.
Same.
I don't necessarily disagree. However, most of you are in a situation where you have mentors, you have opportunities to come to conferences. You're actually at one, right? But there are many people who submit to the JD who don't have that responsibility, who don't have that opportunity, right? And when I'm operating as an editor, I'm going to think about that. Now, I am going to still desk reject a lot of papers, so that, that's kind of an issue. But I'm also going to recognize that if you're coming from a place, where you don't have the kind of support that you do, that I'm going to have to treat your paper a little bit differently. And I, in fact, do that, right? And so, I want to just acknowledge that not everybody has this opportunity.
Yeah, so I think we all agree with that too.
I try to be contrary.
Yes.
Okay, so what would be the difference between like a very good top-field journal paper and a general interest? Like, how will you decide like what's the borderline point?
You want to go first?
Yeah, let me go first, actually.
No, I think, part of the question, anything that's in development economics belongs to the Journal of Development Economics. And I get this question all the time, like, what the heck is development economics, right? And I learned from my colleague, David Weil, that sort of economics is what economists do. And I have the same kind of answer. Development economics is what development economists do. That is to say, when I see a paper, I ask myself, does this paper kind of fit? Is it going to be of interest to at least quite a number of people who identify in some way as a development economist? So that doesn't really answer the top journal development side, but it does answer the development economics versus other. And so then Rema can address the bigger.
Yeah, no, and this is very hard. And I know it must be very frustrating because sometimes, you get papers that are very nice. I've really enjoyed reading, and they're not necessarily going to get into a general interest journal. And I think part of it is that we're looking for two things. One, a new contribution and something bigger than what we know before from the literature, something that changes our mind about the way we think about things. And then the second is with this appeal to people from other fields as well. And, that one, is a little bit harder because, not everyone might necessarily, so that one we also have to make a judgment call on. And, so at the end of the day, it's about really thinking about what is the contribution of knowledge. And I know that's a little bit fuzzy, and I know that's a little bit hard to articulate, but actually one thing that you can do in that regards is, for me, I think the papers that have the best shot and that the referees respond to is when you do the work and you actually articulate why this is a contribution to knowledge. So I often get a lot of papers where the intro is, okay, here's a lit review and here's 30 papers. But it's not really, or something like this is the first paper to do X. Well, why do we care that this is the first paper to do X? That's also not helpful. But really thinking, and it's, I think we get so busy on the analysis and making sure all the analysis is right. But, the other big step you need for the general interest journal is, where are you contributing to knowledge? And so really thinking through, this is the literature, this is what we learned, this is what I'm adding to it, this is what it's exciting, this is what it means, maybe this is what it means for policy or the way we think about certain types of models, but you have to do that work as well because the referees won't do it. The referees are tired, they're reading the papers, quickly, and so they'll say, oh, I don't understand why this is a contribution. And so you have to do the work for them and really try to articulate why they should care, I guess. I don't know, Ben, you want to?
Yeah, let me actually completely second that. I think that sort of that piece of your paper where you sort of say, why is this paper important and new is really important. And I think we all look at that to try to help us understand how does this fit into the literature? And is it really an important contribution? So don't skimp on the thinking on that part. I think Rema's totally right. Let me say also a little bit at AJ Applied, the way we think about where we fit is, I actually think we think our empirical standards, I think we think of as basically the same as the top journals pretty much. So we want papers that are really, as empirically convincing as probably what Rema or Melissa is going to look for at the AER or the JPE. I think the difference is that we just feel a little bit more flexible in terms of, is the contribution slightly more specific, a little bit, but not much. So I think we're still looking for the same empirical standards, but just have a little more flexibility on the sort of general interest question.
Yep, and I would like to also just reiterate what's been said. I think oftentimes you'll see people say, and this paper is the first to do X. where X is some, appropriately defined thing, which in some sense, unless you literally like plagiarize somebody else's paper, it's the first paper to do something, right? And so I think, taking that a step further and saying, why should other researchers in your field be interested? Why should people potentially across fields? Does this have implications for people, for questions in other fields as well? I think that's important to actually articulate that, as opposed to just being solely focused on like the finding is the first finding of X. Talk more about its applicability to things that economists, people in your field are interested in more generally.
Yeah, I would just add, I think one of the big reasons I desk reject is exactly this piece in the introduction. I mean, when I write back with a desk reject letter, I often tell you why. And I think 90% are because it's just not broad enough as a contribution, or there's not enough of a contribution over the literature. And so I think articulating that well is 80% of your way to not getting desk rejected first. I think the second piece is, it might be useful to do this, is talk to people in other fields and run your intro, that paragraph by them, or those 2 paragraphs by them, because sometimes we don't understand the implications for other areas, other places. Just even understanding, does a macroeconomist find this interesting? Maybe not a macroeconomist. Sorry. Oh, wait. Doug's not even in the room. But just like trying to understand if someone else would find that interesting or useful might help you think about how to frame the contribution.
Melissa, can I ask a question and then answer it, and then I've been thinking about like, what do I actually think if I was in the audience, like you guys should ask, what's the question you should be asking? I'm going to pose one, which is, sorry, it's fine. What should I do?
Just takes over. Yeah, exactly.
Answer it. Fine. Here's the question I think you should ask. What should I do when, not if, what should I do when my paper gets rejected? Because that's going to happen to all of you. It happens to all of us. And I feel like, honestly, like that's a question I think is helpful to discuss. So maybe I'm going to pose that to the panel, and then answer it, and then
Okay.
and then we can go back.
So the first thing I do is I don't look at the referee reports right away, because I know I'm going to be sad. I know it's, look, we put so much of our like heart and soul into our work. That's why we're doing this job. And so, it's like you feel sad. And so I think Ben mentioned this as well. The first thing I do is say, okay, and I put it aside and I don't look at it for like a week or so. And then with like a clearer head, I go through. And then I do several things. The first thing I do is I try to say, look, I might get some of the same referees, I might get different referees. So I try to think about what are the big issues I need to address, fix all the little typos and stuff too. But you might not necessarily do everything in the reports, but you want to hit the main ones, the ones that are really fundamental. And sometimes the editor letter will give you some guidance on that. The referees often write main comments and then smaller comments. And so you want to think through what are like the 3 or 4 big things that you want to change about the paper, and then try to get it out quickly because it takes time on the journals. The other thing I would do is think hard about where to send it. One of the things I try to do as an editor, and I know others try to do as well, is, we see a lot of papers, and many of us have been through various journals, and so understand sort of what the standards are at different journals and where things might fit. So I try to give some guidance on where might be a good place to send it next. It's free disposal. You don't have to use it, but it's something to try to help you think about where might be a good place to place it. And so it's worth trying to think about that very carefully.
Yeah, I agree with Rema. I would just say lots of people try to do the smaller things and not the big things and then send it to someone else. Don't do that, because the referee doesn't care about the smaller things. If they get it again, they're going to be like, did you do the big things I asked for? But the temptation is, oh, I'll just do the small stuff. I think you should do the opposite. If you ignore the small stuff, nothing's going to happen. If you ignore both, it's pretty bad with the same referees. But I would just, agree with Rema. I would do the same.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, as has been emphasized, you should just expect this to happen. It happens all the time. I think you should read through the comments and with an open mind, put them into a bin of like, this is something that makes sense versus it doesn't. And I think like in my experience, like our left tail in economics of referee reports is not that bad. Like it could be much worse. And I think it is actually worse in some fields, but there's still a left tail. People may have just completely misunderstood what your paper's about, spent 5 minutes on it. Like sometimes that happens. When that does happen, you can still ask yourself, is there some clearer way that I can communicate things so that people are less likely to get confused, even if they're reading this very quickly. So kind of divide into that, versus, comments that like you can understand where they're coming from. And then I think you have to kind of, at the end of the day, it's your paper. You have to make a decision about whether doing that thing that they want makes sense. But as has been said, understanding that the same people might get it again, or even if they don't, that didn't come out of nowhere, right? Other people might have correlated concerns. And so I think, thinking carefully through the feedback, and like even if your first reaction is to be enraged that the person hasn't read the thing, like you think about, is there some way I can clarify this, make the writing clearer, make my points come through more clearly, so even that referee who has very little time to put into this at least kind of understands the point of the paper. Everything from that to the other end of the spectrum would be they want you to do something that would take 2 years of your life, and you don't have to do it. It may not be worth the cost, and that's that's fine as well. And you just acknowledge why you don't do that in the paper and why it's still a valuable paper.
Okay, I'll give 2 answers to my own question. Number 1 is just to echo what's been said. What I like to do is think through my referee reports from the perspective of, the referee reports I got were drawn from some distribution of possible referee reports I could get. What are the things that are here that are likely to be general and come up again and again, versus what do I think is likely to be idiosyncratic to this referee just to happen to have some particular view. So try to fix the things that you think are likely to come up again and again, and don't deal with treat it as when you get a revise and resubmit, it's very different. You actually have to, follow the editor's guidance very carefully and do all the stuff. But from this case, think of what's general, do that. Don't feel like you need to address every single thing. And the second thing is, don't sit on the paper forever. Figure out what you're going to do it, and send it off somewhere else. The paper should be spending more time sitting on editors' desks than sitting on your desk. And I've seen this happen where people get a paper, they get it rejected, they're like, not sure what I should do, and then it sits on their desk for years. And that's not what you should do. So sit for a week, calm down, approach it, figure out kind of what the general issues are, make a plan, do them, and send it back to another journal.
So I want to just add one of the things that I see people not doing, and this would be sort of applicable both to this case that Ben asked, but also the case of revise and resubmit, is actually not reading the editor's letter, right? When I write an editor letter on a decision, I usually try to emphasize what were the key things that made up my mind. Well, if I think that way, probably Ben thinks that way too, or whoever else the next editor will be. So I think reading the editor letter is really important. And when I get revise and resubmit, it's often the case, not often, but it's sometimes the case that people go through a lot of details on the referee reports and they ignore my letter, right? They don't actually respond to the editor letter. Now, as an editor, I'm the one who makes the decision. If you respond to my questions and you do a good job with the things I point out to the referee, I'm likely not to send it back to the referees, and it's going to make everything happen much more quickly. So it's really important to read the editor. And if the editor says, you have some latitude with the referees, you do have some latitude with the referees. You can say this referee comment didn't make any sense. If the editor says, this was wrong, you have to accept that because they're the one making the decision.
Yeah, just add something to what Andrew said. I've been doing this in my R&Rs, which is, sometimes the case comes up where something the referee asks you to do is really 2 years of data work. And, the editor does not know that ex ante because they don't know the particular case of data. So actually in my R&Rs, I've been offering everybody a chance to chat about the comments. There is very little take up of this, almost zero, to the point where I have 3 sentences because, and it still doesn't get take up. So I would say, if you are doing an R&R with me, please feel free to reach out because the only one case has taken it up in almost 3 years I've been there. And it was literally that case. They said, look, we can do this that the referee wants. I had said in my editor's letter, this is really important. They go, it's 2 to 2.5 years of work. to get all of this data put together. And I went, okay, not worth it. I think it's fine if you do something smaller, right? So I do think we don't know everything as editors. We're not studying your particular problem ever, almost ever. And so, we're gonna, even in our cover letters, say things that might not be always doable. And you shouldn't feel like all hope is lost if I can't do everything, right? There is room for understanding what's the make or break, and we don't write letters that way. But I would just encourage you not to feel like you have to answer everything perfectly to the T. Answering nothing is bad, but I don't feel like all hope is lost if you can't do everything.
Can I add one thing to that? Because you was also making me think of something I add to my letters now as well, is that sometimes, the referees are going to ask you to do lots of robustness checks and lots of additional things. And it might be that not everything is going to work out. There might be one thing where the coefficient looks kind of similar, but it's no longer significant, or like this is a little bit messy, or, and trying to write like a 2-pager on why you're not doing it, or some, I'm like, okay, I understand that not everything is going to work out. We see this all the time. Being much more upfront with why it works out, what it doesn't, what does it mean, the implications for the results. We understand that not everything is going to be perfect in the revision. We're trying to, when I think about giving an R&R, I'm thinking there's enough here that I'm really excited about it. Now I want to see these additional things and make it a cleaner paper, easier to understand, seeing these other checks, cleaning up the story, doing a little bit more analysis to tell the story. But it's not make or break that any one little robustness check most of the time is not going to make or break the paper. So it is much better to be transparent about what you can and can't do. And if there really is an issue, send an email.
I wanted to add to that. I mean, in part because of our adoption of registered reports, it's really caused me to think differently about these sorts of issues. If I suggest some robustness check and you fail it and I reject the paper for that reason, then I'm creating publication bias, right? So I'm very wary of doing that. And so I'd much rather have a transparent result, as Rema said, that says, we did this, it failed, but it still should be published. That's the whole point behind registered reports. It's the whole point behind trying to reduce publication bias in the process.
And sometimes I have one example of my own where it fails for a very good reason. And you explain why. And the editor goes, oh yeah, makes sense. Didn't think about that. All right, good. Let's move on, right? So don't always feel like if something fails, it's necessarily bad.
Yeah, and I think one more thing on this point is please don't try to bury it in lots of things that people didn't ask for. I remember once as a referee, I got a 256-page response to my 1-page comment. So please, do what they ask for. You do not need to do other things that they do not ask for.
Okay, thank you for this. This is very helpful. I guess, I don't know if this is a trivial question, but how do we know which journals to send to? Especially if we're not necessarily just going on the market or just submitting our 10-year packet. Is there a downside to just starting with top journals? So that's on the vertical, how to choose which journals to send to, and then also just more horizontal, is there a journal fixed effect or is it more of an editor fixed effect?
One they are.
Okay, so I think all of us are going to have different points of view, and it's going to depend a bit on the paper. I do like to start with top journals, but sometimes, closer to your tenure clock, you might necessarily not want to do that. Or you've gotten some feedback on the paper. This is an interesting result, but it's probably, this is some of what we were talking about, shopping around, getting feedback. You've made it the best you can. Maybe it's not as huge as a contribution as you wanted when you started, and you might want to send it to a field journal. So I think a lot of these things are going to be a little bit subjective. And so I do think this is where you want to reach out to people and ask. You want to present your work. You want to try to get feedback. You want to talk to your senior colleagues. On the journals to try, I do think if there is no, the truth is, if there's no one on the editorial board who cares about development, or, it's going to be harder to get in. So you might, so so you do want to look a little bit that there is some sort of editor support, I guess, or interest, I think, or that the journal has published these kind of papers before. before you send, although I think at this point, most journals
I think
have
almost
people,
all
yeah,
have a
nowadays
development
they
one now.
most have somebody.
Yeah, we have.
Yeah.
I guess you should also ask
Yeah.
your advisors for sure. That's another one. I think, when you do seminars, it's perfectly reasonable to have a conversation with a senior person saying, where do you think I should send this? I think that's a fair question to ask any seniors when you're on a seminar. They don't mind telling you. So I would do that too, is just get some advice on where. And then, like they said, editors, I should have said in Restat, there's no option on the form to pick an editor, but you can in the cover letter. One thing I should have said, because I don't think people know that. So, having a development editor is very useful in general.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple things. The first is on where to send it vertically. One thing I do with my own work is to say, like, if I was the referee, and clearly if I'm a referee, I'm going to like my own paper more. But if I'm a referee and I would say, I don't think this paper is like a great fit for the AER or AJ Applied or whatever, I'm probably not going to send it there. So I do ask myself, because I feel like at least if I don't like them, I'm pretty positive of my own paper. So, that helps me a little bit. Second thing is when you get the editor letter, if you get rejected, then you often will get some sense of like, was it close or was it like totally a non-starter? And like, if it's close, you might take another draw at kind of a comparably ranked journal and see what happens. And if it was like a completely non-starter, you might get a sense of like, this paper is probably, I should like, look for a more specialized journal. And certainly that's how I think about it for my own work. And I think probably that's a reasonable set of ways of thinking about it. The second thing is on the editors, like, I think that we all try to be as broad as we can and to be as open as we can. And I think both in terms of, my own papers I handle and how I sort of organize the journal, we try to make sure we cover everything as widely as possible. And we try not to be super narrowly focused about the particular areas we work in. That said, so as an editor, I try to say like, we try to be as broad and it shouldn't matter. Tell you for my own papers, like, yes, I look at the editors at the various journals and see who do I think would be like, know something about this area. I don't think it's required. I think we all try to be as broad as possible, but I'll tell you that like, I don't think it's crazy to look at the editorial boards of the various papers and see who's going to be who's likely to be the set of people handling your editors. And if you think there's like all else equal, maybe you could try something that's a little more similar. I don't think that's crazy. Like certainly that's what I do with my own paper. So I don't feel comfortable saying you shouldn't do that. Although as an editor, we really try to not have that bias and try to be as broad as possible.
Yeah, and I should add to that. I think it was like Stefan or somebody looked at like within the journals, we send it out to referees. We try to find the best. We spend some time thinking about who are the best referees from the paper. And the decisions, because this is a process and you're trying to get experts in the field to weigh in. And, sometimes we do overturn referees, but it is very highly correlated also as well with the referee decisions and not just the reject or not reject, but the information that they're often giving us in the editor letter. If it's like they're at the border or they're very enthusiastic, or maybe they'll say revise, but they don't think it's going to get through. And we use that information. So there is a bit of an editor effect, even though we try to be broad, but there is a process in place in the background where we're trying to get the best referees, and they really are making a significant, they're really contributing to the decision.
Yeah, I think another side of this is, I handle a lot of papers, many of them not in my field. And I think like the main place where it comes in is actually desk rejection. So if I get assigned something that's really far from what I do, I'm going to be more conservative on desk rejecting it. Actually, if it's very close to what I do, I know what the reports are going to look like. I've seen lots of them, right? And it's actually like, I know it really sucks to get desk rejected, but it's actually like the best outcome in some sense, because like you can move on much faster, to another journal, especially like you said, if you're close to the job market or close to tenure, time may really be of the essence, but like it does definitely come into play there. I only want a desk reject if I'm very confident actually that it's not going to go through. And that's going to be, I'm less able to be very confident if it's pretty far from my area of expertise.
We all do questions. I think there was a bunch of hands.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the obvious point that development economics, we have 9 co-editors who are development economists. and what that means is, they have different levels of expertise, so we can target papers more finely than general interest journals.
So my question is about how to decide the border of a paper, because for PhD student, we work on the border of a paper. So when to stop, because for PhD, we work for years on a project and our job market paper will be 100 pages. And sometimes I got comments that you should split this paper into two. Sometimes they say you should really keep it one. I'm wondering your experience with this kind of situation.
Okay, maybe I'll go first. So I think, first of all, paper can't be 100 pages. So like, some journals have like a 45-page limit. Even the ones that don't, that's about approximately the limit. The way you should
That's
think.
including tables, not text 45 pages.
Yeah, it depends. Each of the journals have different, you can go on their websites and they all mostly say. The way I would think about it is, so what I would not do is intentionally, strategically try to subdivide your paper to get as many publications possible. I would say of all this material, what is the single best paper I can write? And put whatever you think is in there to make the single best paper you can write. After you do that, if there's stuff left over, take the next stuff and like find the next principal component. Like what is the next, single best paper I can write with whatever's left over and go like that. Like you should not intentionally try to withhold stuff to try to get 2 or 3 publications. You should try to write the best paper you can, but within the constraints of like, it has to be sort of within the page limits.
Yeah, we see this a lot with experiments where there's cross treatments. People will try and split it into 2 papers, except there's somewhere a registry now because the AAR requires, or the AA requires for all of those to be registered. So every referee goes and checks and then comes back and goes, well, they're only reporting half the treatments. Where's the other half? So if it's an experiment with cross treatments, never do that. Everybody will know, the referees are going to come back to us. It will get rejected just because people will feel like they're missing half the experiment. So that's a good example.
I would say not never, but I would say hardly ever. I would just use the guide. I would say use the guideline of like what is sometimes it is conceptually different. So I wouldn't say never, but.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's not only just experiments. I've gotten referees being like, well, this person has written another paper, and so this isn't that much of a large contribution to the literature. And so you can crowd yourself out. So that's not necessarily bad. It's also sometimes you have other, the referees will come back and say, well, this main results is interesting, but there's no description of the mechanisms or the analysis. There's no storyline there. And then you realize you've split it up into like 3 different papers. And then the referees are like, well, maybe this is in this paper, but but then this paper in itself is not strong. So all you can do is like hurt yourself. I completely agree with Ben. You want to think about what is the strongest paper you can write. And you want it to have a very clear, like I say, we're all storytellers. You want it to have a very clear story about what you're trying to say about the world. And you want to bring in the right, you should think about it that way, that you want to bring in the right information and analysis to tell the story. So it shouldn't have every result that you've calculated or done. But it also shouldn't be missing pieces that are in other random papers.
And one more thing on this point, this was actually advice I got from Ben, and I think it's some of the best advice of my career. Like, what you put in the paper should not be proportional to the amount of time that you spent on it. Like, you might have spent a lot of time doing something that turned out not to be so essential for the paper. And if you spend a lot of time on it in the paper, it's going to hurt the impact of the paper. And so get feedback. It's hard to take yourself out of your mindset of I spent 3 months on this, but try to get feedback from others, your classmates, colleagues, etc., to figure out what's the most important to the story versus this is what I spent a lot of time on.
Somebody described it as I gave a presentation and afterwards someone came up to me and they were like, that sounds like what I did on my summer vacation. That's not what you want. You want it to have a very clear story, a storyline, basically.
Following up on Tavneet's earlier point about chatting with the editor, what are your views about approaching the editor in the nice outcome of an R&R when things get unclear about how to follow their guidance?
In my case, it's very clear. I say in the letter, come to me.
I'm also,
I think there really are questions. We're happy to do that. I mean, by the time we get to, revise and resubmit, we've really invested in this paper, and maybe it's a sunk cost fallacy, but we're very disappointed when something that we've had to revise and resubmit doesn't actually make it, or it takes another 3 rounds, right? That's a waste of our time too. And so yes, if it really is a important question that you think that would be great. If it's like, do I need to fix the footnote on table 3? I wouldn't bother the editor with that.
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly the same thing. So let us go to more questions.
Wait, actually, I'm going to disagree a little bit. So I know that in general, so I also write a letter saying, please consult me, but I actually think the bar should be reasonably high. So I think like in the sense of like most of the questions you can probably figure out yourself. So I do think if it's I think that Tavneet's example of like, this is going to take me 2 years. Do you really want me to do that? Or like the thing you suggested doesn't work for some pretty fundamental reason and you've really thought hard about it and you're really pretty confident, I would say yes, absolutely 100%. But I do think like, we're all adults and you should try to like see if you can solve the answers yourself. So I think you should use that, but I think you should use it like only for kind of these more important cases. That's my own view. Like,
I would just add one thing, Gabriel, which is what Andy said earlier is really important. Read the editor's letter. Often I tell people, these are the things I care about. The rest, try and answer, but that means try and answer, but I don't really care. Like, I mean, I care, I want it to be the best paper possible, but it's not gonna cause me to reject it. So I think really internalizing the editor's letter is super important here. I just want to emphasize that. At least I do that. Everybody's nodding. We use the letter to give you a roadmap of things we care about that will lead to an acceptance. As Andrew said, we want the paper to get in. We're trying to give you a chance to get it in. And so I would spend more time even on the editor's letter than the referee reports because they're giving you what you need to do absolutely. And it's often a subset of the 20,000 comments in the referee report.
Yeah, and just to add to that, oftentimes the referees are like doing they're thinking hard about your paper and suggesting everything in the world you could possibly do, including like things like write this additional model, which is going to go into Appendix F in the paper. And so oftentimes in the editor letter, I'm writing, well, this is very interesting, but I think this is beyond the scope of the paper. So you could add a sentence or describe in words what, the implications of this. You should listen to that. I'm giving you an out. You shouldn't go and write the model that's going to end up in Appendix F. Like oftentimes we're trying to help you save you some work and think about what's important to focus on. Just because my view of, any one paper is not, you can't do everything in the world for any one paper. And so we're trying to give you some guidance on what's really important to narrow down on. And so it's really, really important to follow the advice. And sometimes I'm really shocked. I've told someone they don't have to write this model for like the 5th appendix and they do it anyway. And then I'm like, they could have spent the time doing something else.
Yes. Rejection resubmit. Why do they happen? How should we feel about it? And what should we do?
We all have different, this one's going to be a
this is
strong
going to
one.
be, it's hard because on one hand, you sometimes want to give people a chance, but I think they should be used very, very sparingly because I don't want to, waste people's time. So when I think about trying to give an R&R, I'm trying to think about, is there enough there that I think the paper is interesting enough and it's going to go through, barring some like you rerun everything and realize there's a typo and all the results have gone away or something, that there's enough there. So I try to, I view it as like, if you do what I ask you to do, it's like a, commitment, and not always, but for the most part, it's a commitment that we're going to follow through on it. So I use our rejection resubmits very sparingly myself because I don't want to tell you to do all this work. And then the one time I do use them is that if I think the paper is kind of innovative and new, and I really want to give you a chance, but I'm just not sure there's enough there to signal that it's a really major revision, I'll get back. I think I've given like 2 in like 9 years. So I like to focus on, this is interesting enough. I see enough here. Let's get you through. But some editors love to use rejection resubmits. I think there's a huge spectrum. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so at AJ Applied, I try to use them and have our co-editors use them approximately never. For the reason, I think I don't like them. So like in my journal, like at our journal, we really try not to do them. I will say that we have had a debate among the co-editors, and I think that we have occasionally done them if we think that there's where we think the paper really has a lot of promise, but there's enough uncertainty that we do it. But like, I'm going to tell you, like from my own experience, having written a bunch of papers, like the thing, my most negative publication experience was a reject and resubmit that didn't work out, where I put a huge amount of effort into it and was addressing a bunch of idiosyncratic referee comments. And I felt like that effort was wasted. And so like, that's why as an editor, I try to, because I think that going back to my previous comment, I feel like referee reports are drawn from a distribution of possible referee reports. And for when you actually have a revised and resubmit, you have to handle the particular particular draw that you have to deal with. So I think it's very inefficient to have a reject and resubmit where you have to deal with that particular idiosyncratic draw of referee reports if it's going to get rejected for some totally other reason. So we try at AJ Applied to use them extremely sparingly.
When I use them like sparingly, it's usually because like a referee, it's clear that the paper as is not above the bar, but a referee has made kind of a very insightful comment. Well, if they actually reframed this and did this other thing, it would be a bit of a different paper, but I think like that would be really cool. And so it's not like something you could do in the future, but it's a way the paper could be kind of like completely reframed into something that's making a different contribution, but it's like too much. I don't want to give an R&R because the odds of it working out aren't that high. And so I try to make that clear in the letter, for these reasons, it's not above the bar the way it is now. This referee had a very insightful comment, I think. And, if you were to choose to go that direction and take a paper a different route, I would consider that to be a new submission. And you're able to submit it again. So basically, even if you have the paper have the same title, you're not going to get desk rejected for double submitting it. But it's not like, it's very different from a revise and resubmit where it's like, do these things, and then there'll be a high probability of acceptance. It's like somebody suggested a way that's probably a huge amount of work that this paper could be made very different. Like we think that that's very, that sounds potentially very promising, but if you do go that route, it's going to be treated as a new submission, which means amongst other things, I'm not guaranteed to be the editor again. You're not going to have the same report. So it's more just an opportunity, like when there's a paper that like somebody had an insight, like that, or maybe multiple referees thought that this should be kind of radically reworked. Like if you do that, we'll give you a chance to submit it to this journal again, because we think it's promising and it's actually a different paper.
Yeah, I'll say I have a policy of never using them except for one situation, because we added short papers. If I want to switch it to a short paper, I don't think we can do that directly in the system. So it comes in as a new submission. So I use a reject and resubmit for a paper that's a long paper that should be a short paper. And I also want to give the authors the option not to have to shrink it and go somewhere else. So that is the only time I will use it in general. I give pretty hard R&Rs. I'm very clear in the R&R letter that, I think this is a really cool idea or something, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through, or, so my R&R letter gives you a sense of probabilities. And if I think the paper has what Melissa has, I'll write that in the reject letter. I won't do a reject and resubmit. I'll just say, there's a different paper to be written here. You can choose if you want to write it, but up to you. And
I'll just say the same thing. If I was in Melissa's situation, I'd reject your paper, but I'd tell you to think about that and send it somewhere else.
It is a rejection. Like that's how it's entered, at least in our journal, that's how it's entered in the system. But like, then you wouldn't, if you're going to change it substantially, you wouldn't be able to submit it to us again. And like reject and resubmit gives you the opportunity to change it substantially and resubmit it. But it's like, at least the way that we use it, it's different than a revise and resubmit. It's not going back probably to the same referees.
Do we?
Yeah, more questions.
Let's take some more questions.
Over here in the back one.
Your experience, what's the average referee's rule of thumb for deciding whether to give an R&R, reject, and is it fair, and how to improve it, etc.?
I have to say, I don't ignore what the referees say. I ask them to do it and I look at it. But I don't actually take it that seriously, because my view is the referees have no idea what the competing papers are. They have no idea what you've published in that literature. They have no idea what the bar is in my head, right? If I've published 6 things on this particular topic, the bar is going to be different than I've never seen this topic before, right? So I think, referees, should make these comments and so forth, but I always take them, with a lot of salt, because I think that's really my job, is to make that determination. And these are just suggestions based on very little information in most cases.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I actually probably put more weight on the referees than the other. Sorry, I just want to be honest.
Yes, no, that's fine. That's
Sorry.
and partly a development journal.
Correct.
I know the
That's,
field.
you know, the
Yeah.
field. I handle actually probably only a third or half of development papers, half of the papers that end up on my desk. I'm doing a bunch of just general applied micro actually at the end of it. So I do rely on referees, especially when it's far from me. I'm going to rely on referees more, especially on the contribution question, right? If I'm doing an, environment paper that's in the US, I'm going to try and get referees who are in that literature, and I'm going to listen to them on contribution more than I would myself. In development, that's right. I feel like I have a sense of contribution better. So this comes from just seeing non-development papers as well. So I do rely on referees a lot. How do they decide? I try to find referees who are in the same topic, who are answering similar sets of questions, who have worked in this area before, so they can speak to contribution, right? And I think for them, they're going to be looking for things that are novel, depending on where the journal is. How novel depends on where you're sitting in this panel, and whether it's kind of, adds to the literature in some way. And then, of course, they're going to worry about the implementation of the question, right? Did you do all the robustness checks? Did you use the new definitive tools? Whatever version of that they're going to do, right? And sometimes actually what happens, this is, the previous question, should I take it on the road or not? Sometimes it's not even that they like the question. There's just so many things wrong or to do in the empirics. They just go, there's just too much here. That's why taking it on the road and getting comments is really good, because sometimes the referees just get over, kind of say, there's just too much here, even though maybe it's doable. I think it's too far away, right? And so the comments really help avoiding those sorts of things, where you can kind of check off a set of general things that would come up. But I think the referees do think about contribution, if they're the right referees, and the implementation of what how you actually, is it causal, whatever the pieces are, did you actually answer the question well enough for them?
Yeah, so I'm gonna add, I think, look, I'm always, I enjoy reading the referee reports. I think like 95% of the time, they're super thoughtful. People take it very seriously. You learn things, you see different people's perspective on the question. And so, as somebody who, especially in development, you're getting papers that are often not exactly your particular field, and you learn a lot from the reports, and so it's really fun. Like the 5% of the time, I get reports that I find less useful. So I'm going to give some examples of reports that I find less useful. So the first one that I find less useful is, I'm not going to engage because this didn't follow the pre-analysis plan exactly. I get that. I get that more often than you would think. And then I don't know what to do, because partly you're doing the data analysis, you're learning. We all know that there are some things in the pre-analysis plan that you're going to do, and then you're going to start analyzing the data, and it's going to go in a different direction. And, so engaging with it still, and, pointing out, maybe I wanted to see this, I was in the pre-analysis plan and not on the paper, but I want to understand more why you went in that direction, and just engaging with the material is very useful. Another one that I don't find very useful is, and I still get it, although less than I used to, of oh, this is a paper in China, so it's not externally valid to the rest of the world. And I do not know what to make out of that. And so those are the two types of referee reports I get the most, that I find very unhelpful. But for the most part, I feel like people take it seriously, And I know sometimes, for me, I know it's hard to read the referee report sometimes on my own papers. I get, I get upset, I get sad. I'm like, why don't they understand? And then, and then when I look at it with a clear head, I realize, well, maybe I didn't explain it well enough. Or maybe they're saying I should have done all these things and I didn't do them. And, I do think they have a lot of content, and I do find them, at least for me, I feel like the referees are very, very thoughtful most of the time about where they see the paper, because I think we all know it's important, and I think people really do take it seriously.
Yeah, just to add an epsilon on Rema's, I have had cases where the referee is actually wrong. And I do actually write to the author and say, look, even if I'm rejecting a paper, I'll say, look, I didn't put any weight on this referee because the author is going to go, oh my God, this is wrong. They didn't even read the paper. If the referee is really super wrong, we can tell. And I'll usually tell the author, look, that did not drive my decision. Here's what drove the decision. But please know, I understand that this referee was wrong. And so don't stress about it, right? So we will, at least I think all of us will do that. If there's something obviously wrong in the referee reports, we will discount them.
And I think like a variation of this theme is, you know, before I've had the situation where the referee said something at the bottom of page 5, you didn't cite this other study. And then the author is, you know, writes back, you know, upset and wanting another opportunity with the paper because actually I cited it in footnote 17. And oftentimes, like that is not the reason that your paper is going to get rejected again. As you know, the emphasis has been on like the contribution and, you know, how rigorous is it? Is it correct, right? And but there may be various minor wrong things, and usually that is not kind of what the editor is relying on.
I want to add one thing, which is to remember that you guys only see half of what we see. So every referee writes a anonymous referee report that goes, and those of you who've been referees know this, right? So they write an anonymous referee report that goes to the authors, and they write a confidential cover letter to the editors. And the confidential cover letter is often a bit more blunt as to kind of what they actually think. And we are seeing we are sort of seeing all of that from all the referees and kind of, you know, integrating over all that and kind of making a decision. And I think we try to convey in our letters that what was said before, like what is the reason, but just keep in mind, if a paper gets rejected for, you know, and here's the reason, and you go to the reports and you're like, but it wasn't in the reports. Like just try to remember that the editors are seeing more than you're seeing and trying to integrate over that and giving you some, you know, appropriately anonymized signal about that. And just keep that in mind. Because I often get sort of the feedback of like, well, I didn't see it in the report. Like, but just remember there's another piece that we are seeing that you're not seeing.
Yeah, one example of that just quickly is even if you've articulated contribution very well, they might put in the cover letter, this is not good enough for your journal. But it won't be in the referee report because that's confidential to the editor and they don't have anything to say about your contribution. You've articulated very clearly, they just don't think it's important enough. And so that's a big example where there's a discrepancy between the two.
Yep.
So related to what you're saying, this is kind of a two-sided job with admit papers and with referee papers. So I wonder how does like a really useful referee report looks like.
I can do some of that. So some people don't write cover letters. Please write a cover letter. 80% of referees write cover letters, and probably, you know, half of those are very useful. You don't need to just summarize what's in your referee report. I'm going to read your referee report. So we get a bunch of cover letters that are just a summary of that. That's not super useful for me. What's useful is really like, do you think it's a good fit for Restat? Why or why not? I don't need a summary of your comments because I'm going to read them. It's not like I'm going to skip those somehow, right? So cover letters really, really important for us, actually. I find them very useful, especially when it's not super close to what I do. It's a good way for me to think about the problems. That's one. Two, you know, there's lots of small comments. Those are not particularly useful for the decision. They're good for the referee. A lot of referees approach it as, I need to figure out everything that's wrong with a paper. And I think this leads to these very long referee reports. I prefer a referee report that's structured with what are the big things wrong that need to be fixed. And then, you know, the smaller stuff is less relevant in the grand sense. So if you're going to suggest a rejection of a paper, the smaller stuff is just not important. And you know, I'd rather a referee report comes in 2 weeks earlier with no small stuff and all the big stuff than it comes in 2 weeks later, because I really want to get back to authors. So I think, you know, don't write 10 pages. To be honest, I have a referee report that just came in. You know, it is longer, but they point out one core issue, literally just one. And I'm like, okay, we're done. Like, I'm going to have to reject the paper, right? So something like that is super useful, which is not super strong, but it has an issue that I didn't even notice. And so something like that's super useful. So I would say getting back to editors fast. We're trying really, really hard to get back to people fast. And so getting back to them fast, trying to do big things, you know, Those would be my two.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, oftentimes the best referee reports for me are not only ones that like point out big issues, but maybe give some ideas, if you have them, of like what would be convincing to understand the problem better, and something that's feasible within the data set that you have, or so that I find very useful. The other thing I would note about referee reports, sometimes things are very obvious to you, but might not necessarily be very obvious to the author, or the author is like a junior or at a place where they might not necessarily have gone in the mentoring. And so they might not necessarily know that that's like the obvious robustness check to do. So the reports that I find most useful are ones in which it's also in tone more respectful in terms of saying like, it'd be great to see these things, as opposed to saying, well, this was an obvious robustness check that wasn't done. I mean, I know it's a small difference, but it really does a lot in terms of the motivation of people, in terms of, addressing a report and engaging with you and taking your comments seriously, a little bit on the tone.
So I think a lot about what does this referee know that I don't know as editor, right? And the more that the referee does that, the better. So something like, what are the papers in this literature, right? I might not know the specific literature. Presumably the author is more likely to do so. So they say, look, it's just like this paper, or it contributes to that paper. That's the kind of information as an editor, it's harder for me to keep track of. So that's extremely useful. Particularly if it's a revised, if you're interested in getting the paper, seeing the paper revised, really telling me why you're enthusiastic about the paper. What is it that really excites you about the paper? So often we're sort of referees try to be mechanical and sort of show no emotion, but like, I'd like to know, like, why were you happy you were sent this paper? Everybody says I was pleased to get your paper. I'm sure that nobody actually is pleased to get it. But they read a paper and they find it really interesting, engages them. And so I like when that gets communicated. That's very important. And of course, making sure that the details of the argument are right. It's harder for me to do that given the number of papers I see, to do that extremely well. But just think about, like, what is your comparative advantage relative to the editor, and really emphasize that in your reports.
And I'll just reiterate, you should not feel like you have to write a really long report. Again, we are perfectly happy to get, a 1-page, 2-page at most report that highlights the main issues with the paper. Now if you want to make it longer, I find sometimes like it's really in your field and you just can't stop yourself. Like, okay, that's fine. It's not like we're going to get upset if it's long, but you shouldn't feel like, oh, I need to signal to the editor that I've really read this by making a super long report.
Can I add one thing? We see so many papers with so many referees. Referees assume we're going to remember your referee report for every paper. So it is the signaling piece of Melissa. I want to write a really good report because the editor is going to remember me for years. I'm really sorry we don't. There's just too many. Let me just finish, Ben. Hold your horses. We can't do it. We try very hard with that. So people write referee reports with that view that you'll remember me, and we're just handling too many papers to remember that. We remember incidents. So for me, I remember bad tone incidents. Those will stay with me. In fact, if you write with a bad tone, you'll get an email from me directly saying, don't do this. Right. So I will do that for referees, and I've done it several times, unfortunately. So we remember outlier incidents, but we're not going to remember, you spent 2 weeks thinking, oh my God, I need to write a really good referee report because I'll be remembered. It's impossible for us to do that. There's too many. So try not to be the negative outlier. The positive outliers are separate, but try not to be the negative outlier, and, try to help us rather than signal to us something else, I think.
Do you want to go first?
Yes.
Let me second a few things. I remember the very, very, very small number of people who have been nasty.
Yes.
And so don't be nasty. Like, just try to remember, like, you're on the other side of this. You're going to write a report that you would feel okay getting. And so that's number one. I've only had a couple of incidents in my entire time editing, but I do remember them. Of only a couple. So try to just write a referee report. Just put yourself in the position of like respectful, like this is a referee report. Even if you're rejecting the paper, this is a referee report you would be comfortable like getting. I also remember referees who are like late systematically and who keep promising me the report and don't deliver it. So that's the other thing I remember. So please, like, we are really trying to like get these to move this thing along and get papers back to, you know, authors quickly. And, you know, so again, you can be late if you're going to be late occasionally. Like, we understand the world is complicated. If you write an email saying I'm going to be 1 week late and then you deliver it 1 week later, that's not going to be. But like the people who are like one more week, and it's 3 months later, like that occasionally happens. Don't do that.
Can I just add?
No, I was going to add to this. I've had multiple times junior people tell me that they write really harsh referee reports tearing down a paper because they want to show the editor how they can really, like, how smart they are and how they can think it through. And like that, one, we're not going to remember. Two, we don't find that impressive. And in fact, like Andy said, I often find the best referee reports start off with something nice. I liked this aspect of the paper. This is interesting. I'd like to know more about this, but there are these other issues. And I find that much more helpful. I'm going to put in a big plug on the fact that the development referees, like, you should not accept every paper. You know, this is not, but the development referees I handled, especially when I was at Restat, I was in Tavneet's role where I handled general applied micro for like half my portfolio and environment, and then development for like a third. The development referees are harsher than other applied micro fields. As a field, we want to have high standards, but we also want to remember that we want to put knowledge out there. We want to be excited about things. And so it is really important to, when you are refereeing, not to start in going to paper negative of how can I reject this, but trying to also see what's interesting about it and exciting, and how it's, because at the end of the day, we all want to contribute more knowledge and have it put out there.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I sometimes let referees off the hook because I got 2 reports that gave me something I can reject. Please don't take that as a signal. Everybody goes, no, I'll get it to you in a week. And I'm going, no, I'm not going to remember this. It's not a signal. I'm trying to get back to the authors fast. So when someone lets you off the hook, at least with me, take it, right? Because it has no signal value. Even I sometimes do it even when you're not late, because 2 referees got back to me early. There's enough in there for me to reject the paper. I don't need to spend your time. But whenever I've done this, everybody writes back going, no, I just need 2 more weeks or something. And it's not about that. It's literally, I have enough information. I don't want to waste your time. So if I give you that, please take it. I think this is true for most of us. When you let off the hook, just take it.
So I don't want to scare anybody, but every year I look at who have done multiple referee reports for the JDE. Usually that's a good thing. Sometimes I have access to every referee report that was ever written, at least in the last 10 years, right? And so if I'm trying to make a decision about somebody a 10-year letter, sometimes I will look at that information. So we do have access to that information. You might think about it a little bit, but mostly I want to emphasize that people who regularly get their referee reports in kind, they're high quality. I notice that. Right. And I have the data that I can check that. And, sometimes in those cases, I'll promote to associate editor from just being a referee. It doesn't actually mean anything, except it means that I'm acknowledging that you've been very helpful on a regular basis, contributing to development to the field.
I'll second that. Like, I remember, but like, what's impressive is not length. It's like just being thoughtful. So like, that's what we care about. And it's not like I wrote a 6-page report is not impressive. What's impressive is just like, this is like thoughtful and on time.
And just to second what Andy said is that, all the journals, I think nowadays, we all want to get back to people quickly. And so when you are looking for new journal editors or associate editors or anything like that, you do look at the statistics. Like, this is part of how these things get chosen. And so it is something that does matter.
We actually, like at the AA, when we appoint new co-editors, we explicitly, when we appoint new co-editors, we explicitly look at how people were as a referee, and we do look at sort of like timeliness is an important factor.
Well, let's get more questions then.
Yes.
I just was wondering, like, what would be your advice for a young scholar that wrote a paper, already showed it in some conferences, but then a senior scholar with a better network drops like a very close competing paper at the NDE guard? Like, what would be your advice on this situation?
Oh boy.
Here's what I would do. I would first, I would not delay. I would say this is a, first of all, if you presented it at various conferences or something, then there's a public record of that. That's helpful. You don't have to cite it, but like, and I would write, contemporaneous work is how I would describe it. So like in contemporaneous work, you have to cite the other paper, right? You don't want to hide that, but I would say, our paper's related to blah, 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 in contemporaneous work, so-and-so did thus and such. And then I wouldn't sit on it. I would then, like, the one thing I would do differently is I would then, if you were in the process of like polishing, probably it's now time to start sending it out to a journal. So that's what I would do. And the other thing I'll say is, at least at our journal, I don't know how you guys feel, we don't have the science model of like, if someone came out a week faster, they scooped you and it's over. The way I at least try to think about it is like, we know our publication process is long and it's complicated and people present and it kind of goes around. So the way I don't try to think of priority as like rigid, like who came out a week earlier. It's not the way we think about it. I think we kind of think of like, if something came out like 4 years, like earlier, like that's pretty obviously a priority, but 1 week here or there, a couple months here or there is not really but like, I think it's like, is this thing like obviously first or kind of roughly contemporaneous is kind of the way we think about it. So I would just explain that and then, but don't delay, like get it out at the beginning.
And I should note, so there's a letter that you write to the editor when you submit, and we do read that. And people have emailed me about that, and it's very useful actually. In terms of understanding, these papers were both out contemporaneously, but, my paper has these additional things. And, just so you should not write you should not write a 6-page long letter to the editor when you're submitting. But if there's 1 or 2 helpful pieces of information like that, it's fine to do. And I should also note, people also, because this, I'll just add since I have the mic, people occasionally, if there is a competing paper and you're worried that the other authors are going to be very negative referees, or there's been an issue like any issue like that, people also, again, this should be used sparingly, but you can also put in the letter to me confidentially that there is an issue and I would prefer, there's a competing paper and I'd prefer not to have referees from the competing paper or something like that.
I think there's a range of these problems between contemporaneous and 4 years later, because it take that long to publish papers. So I think be judicious on that. I think the advice varies across that spectrum for me quite a lot, and I'm happy to talk later about it. Just to say, I've used Rema strategy before where I've asked an editor to exclude a referee, and they usually do. But I would use this very sparingly, and you have to explain why. If you just tell me exclude Ben Olken, I don't like him, I'm gonna be like, I'm sorry, it ain't happening, right? So you need to give a reasonable explanation for it, but I have personally used that in the past. Yeah, I said I don't want Ben Olken because I don't like him. I'm joking, of course.
Thank you. So thank you for demystifying the process. I guess I have a question more on the ethical aspects of it. There's been anecdotal evidence. We've heard people, senior, maybe authors we work with saying, we'll target this journal because we know the editor of this journal. From your side of the process, knowing the names or just, knowing the person who's submitting this, how does that impact your side of the decision making? And is there anything that can be done to kind of make this a more
So maybe I'll give you 2 answers there. The first is, at least at our journal, we have very clear conflict of interest policies and rules that are on our website, and we adhere to them quite strictly. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I think we try to be very clear about, make sure that we feel like, and the conflict of interest policy, there's like black letter and there's like, I feel a little conflicted. And we, at least at our journal, we certainly encourage our co-editors. We have enough co-editors that if you feel a little conflicted, like, pass it up to somebody else. Certainly my own personal standard, which I encourage our co-editors to use, is if I ever feel like, oh, it's a little hard one way or the other because I know someone, like, let's just like have someone else handle the paper. That's what I do. The second thing is I'll just point out there was many years ago, at least for, this is not quite the same for editors, but the AEA did a randomized experiment back in the pre-internet days when this was possible, of whether or not it made a difference for the authors to be blinded or not. And if anything, actually, they found that the blinding of the author names actually helped kind of the most senior scholars relative to the others. And that the reason for that is, I think that, you know, if someone gets a paper from insert famous scholar name here and it's a referee, it's like their chance to like really like, you know, and so anyway, just as an I just want to point that out as an empirical fact. It may not necessarily go the way you think.
I think, you know, we're all trying to be very fair. So I just reject famous people all the time, or people that I know, and it's hard. It's not fun. You know, we're people, these things are not fun, but I mean, that's part of the process of being fair. Along these lines, I don't solicit papers because I think then papers I'm going to solicit are ones I see or people I know. But then along those lines, people often try to contact me to sell me a paper, and I'm trying to be very nice, but I'm also trying not to. It's not that I don't want to talk to you about your paper or anything like that. It's just that I'm not, you know, there's a process. We send it out to referees. We try to get referees in your field. We're trying the best we can. And, you know, so we're trying as hard as possible to make it fair. And as Ben says, we all have conflict of interest rules. And all the time I email the lead editor and say, well, actually, this doesn't follow the conflict of interest rule, but I know this person, or I have a paper that is very similar to this person. And I don't want them to think, I'm, being negative on their paper or positive because I have something similar. And so maybe somebody else should handle it. We're all trying to think very carefully about not having these conflicts.
So I wanted to add, I mean, I do all the desk rejects without looking at names as best I can. I sometimes get some nasty letters from my co-editor saying, how did you desk reject me? And you still want me to be a co-editor? But at that level, I can try to be fair. Now, I think the really complicated thing about this is that when I see a paper presented and have a chance to ask questions to the authors, I'm going to be more favorably disposed toward it, both as an editor and as a referee. And it's very hard, I think, to like de-bias that problem. And in fact, referees have seen the paper, they actually have more information, so you don't want to dismiss them. So I think it's, the best advice that comes out of that is it's really useful to have the opportunity to present your paper in terms of in front of people who are likely to be your referees, if you can. Obviously, not everybody has that opportunity, but I think if you think about that problem that way, a lot of the statistics don't really recognize the complexity of that question.
Yeah, and on the note of conflict of interest, I mean, we also have a pretty strict conflict of interest policy. Not everybody knows that, but like I cannot handle a paper of anybody who's been affiliated with Harvard, like in the past, I think 3 or 5 years, obviously co-authors other people in some sense, like I get lots of papers from people I know in some respect. I've seen them at a conference, whatnot. Like, I mean, but again, like we have an acceptance rate of well under 5%. And so like, lots of rejecting people I know. We don't let our co-editors submit to the journal. Like, so I don't have the problem of just rejecting other co-editors. Like, again, because it just like, can you completely, de-bias that? And so we really tried the best that we can to ensure that any kind of explicit conflicts of interest don't arise.
I'll just say one thing. The experiment Ben mentioned is very old. I think the field has changed. I think this happens a lot. And I just want to say, I unfortunately, I think this happens a lot. There's a paper in Restart with networks showing this happens a lot. So I think that is probably pretty close to reality. I think we're all trying hard to undo that the best we can. And some is through conflict of interest policies. Actually, Restart and JPE have this. If you're an editor, you can't submit a paper at all to the journal, period, which I like, because then I don't have to handle papers from my co-editors. And, of course, it penalizes my co-authors in the process, but I like that. It's sort of another way of doing this. And I think, so there's a bunch of policies, and then outside of the policies, I think we're trying very hard to do this, to use our co-editors to go other places for advice within the editorial network. So we make sure we're not doing this. I think the other thing we are doing, but should do more of, is go back and look through decisions and go back and, have other editors just look through what's been happening. And I think, that's data, and it's important data, but I think we're trying our best. And I think will sort of evolve as it goes too.
And I should note, so I agree with Tavneet, we're all trying our best. And I should note, I also really appreciate it. Sometimes, so when we're looking for referees, we're also trying to look for referees without conflict of interest. So not from the same institution, not a co-author, but sometimes we don't know these things. And so I also really appreciate it when a referee says, actually, we have a new paper that I'm starting with this person. And so I feel conflicted. And it's very helpful. And, you know, you should not feel shy about letting us know of conflicts of interest as well, so that we could appropriately deal with it.
Yeah, I would second that from Rema. I have no idea who works with who, especially when it's not development or far from what I work on. So letting us know that so we can be better is also useful.
Okay, we have 3 minutes. So any other questions?
You mentioned Restat short paper, and there's like AR insights and all that. So how would you describe these other than the word count in terms of like the minimum contribution that's required, the novelty of the paper that's required, and also when you're evaluating a CV, how you view that compared to other papers?
Okay, 3 questions. Let me try. So I think of the short papers as, you know, a novel result, which maybe doesn't have all the mechanisms nailed, that has like 1 key result as opposed to 3. You know, often people will throw a bunch of stuff into the paper to make it longer, and you can usually tell in the paper, like the one I just recently did, they literally added a whole bunch of stuff and every referee said, I don't know why this is in the paper. And it was clear that you were just adding stuff to make it a longer paper because we're not used to short papers. So, you know, often it's just 1 key insight that's written up very shortly. You know, I've made this mistake very recently. It should be a long paper. We try to make it a short paper and everybody went, no, you can't make this a short paper. So there are also the other mistakes, like where you want to make it a short paper and you put 20,000 appendices in it. It's not a short paper. So I would say that sort of stuff. How it's viewed on the CV, I think not much differently than regular.
Yeah, at least for Restat, we had extensive discussions about this when we were setting up the short paper, and I think it's similar at a lot of the other field journals where we at first thought we were going to have a separate issue and have like a short paper issue or something, but then we didn't want it to be seen as different than a Restat paper because we still thought this is above our quality bar. But you know, sometimes you could tell a story in a shorter way, and we didn't want people being penalized. So the papers are kind of more mixed into different issues, and we don't distinguish them in the journal on purpose in order to, a Restat paper is a Restat paper.
Yeah, and I think it's seen that way on the CV. I don't see a category that says Restat shorter paper. It just says Restat. And no one looks at page number 27 to 45 or 27 to 35. Like,
and the JD has short ones as well.
Yeah. So I mean, our mantra from the beginning has been the short papers should have the same impact as longer papers, and so far that's been more than true. The sort of early citations, if you take that measure, are better. You know, why is that? You know, I think one of the things that really has to be true of a short paper, it has to be innovative. It has to be doing something that hasn't been done before in a simple way, right? And it has to be straightforward. That is, you can't have a long discussion back and forth with referees about the right way to do it. In fact, that's one of the key aspects. Our process is a little different. We never go back to referees. So the referee reports have to be such that we can make a decision right away. So it's a matter of simplicity and innovation combined with a view that this paper will have an impact either citations or otherwise.
all right, you should just listen to it.
One more question.
I could.
One more question.
One more question.
We can't hear you.
My question is about the cover letter. You said that you expect the author to submit a cover letter when.
Not always. Actually, I hardly ever look at the cover letter unless there's something in there, like writing a cover letter that says, I'd like to submit my paper to you for review, blah, blah, blah. Don't do it. If you have something like so one important one is data. If you have proprietary data and can't make it public, I want to know that in advance. And then the second is if you feel like there's a competing paper or something that the editor needs to know that's not in the paper. So I think for those reasons, you can submit one. At Restat, if you're asking for a specific editor, that's also the cover letter for us. So if you want a specific person to handle it, you would put that in the cover. But we're unusual in that sense. But it's only if it's really something really, really important that's not there.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
totally agree.
I totally agree. I mean, sometimes people will suggest referees and whatnot, but it's hard for us to do anything with that since we're not giving everybody an equal opportunity, right? So mostly it's just about the data policy or some other kind of major issue that we should be aware of.
Let me just add, I can't read the cover letter and do the desk rejects anonymously, right? So I do sometimes look at them, and certainly the editor who requests referees, if they get that far, will look at that more carefully. If you have something you need to say, like a co-editor suggested that you submitted or whatever it is, it's better that the co-editor do that to me directly outside the cover letter process. It doesn't actually show up very easily on my machine.
All right. I know that we're standing between you guys and lunch. So thanks so much. Thanks especially to the panelists.